Okay, so everyone's filing in now. I think I can go ahead and start talking. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the Essex Seminar Series. My name is Kazi. Thanks to everyone for joining us. This is our last seminar of the semester of the year. So we're very excited that you're all here, and we're very excited to have Nicole Riemer here. Is your last name pronounced Riemer? Is
Yes,
that
very good.
correct? Okay. Thank you. So, a couple quick announcements is that the seminar is being recorded. So that will be posted on our YouTube channel in a couple days, usually. I'm a little bit behind. The last one is going to be uploaded sometime today, probably actually right after this. Anyways, so I'm going to introduce our speakers today. So Nicole Riemer is a professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and an affiliate of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She received her doctorate degree in meteorology from the University of Karlsruhe, Germany. Her research focus is the development of computer simulations that describe how aerosol particles are created, transported, and transformed in the atmosphere. Her group uses these simulations, together with observational data, to understand how aerosol particles impact human health, weather, and climate. Nicole Riemer received the NSF Career Award, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, and the AGU Ascent Award. She is the co-chair of the Aerosol Processes Working Group of the Department of Energy Atmospheric System Research Program and editor for Journal of Geophysical Research. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and hand it off to Nicole. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Kathy, for the nice introduction and for inviting me for today's talk. I'm really honored to join the list of speakers that you had for several years now. It's a very impressive list. So I hope to take you into the world of aerosol modeling today. I know it's a group with different wide diversity of backgrounds, so I try to do this a little bit of an overview, a lot of conceptual ideas. How do we approach aerosol modelings? What are the challenges that we are facing? And then I want to really tell you a little bit about the potentials and our achievements in the area of a certain aerosol modeling type, the particle resolved modeling. Yeah, so that's my goal for today. So starting out, big picture. This figure will be familiar to many of you. It shows the effective radiative forcing of different agents in the atmosphere that exert a radiative forcing on the atmosphere. And we all know carbon dioxide, can I use my mouse here? It looks like it, has a positive forcing on the atmosphere, so it exerts a warming. And so there is this one bar down here that exerts a negative forcing, which actually means it offsets the warming from CO2. And these are the aerosols. And so there are two components to it, the aerosol cloud interaction. So aerosols form clouds, and those clouds then cool the climate. And then aerosol radiation interactions. And so this means the aerosols scatter the radiation directly back into space and thereby exerting a cooling. And so the attention I want to draw here is this blue bar here has a large uncertainty. And so what this uncertainty really quantifies is the spread in models. So there are many models that contribute to the estimation of this radiative forcing. And what this means is they don't agree, right? So there's a large spread. And so you might wonder, why is this? Why do models have so much trouble with estimating the aerosol impact on climate? Given that in the past 20 years, we learned so much about the aerosols in the atmosphere. We now understand processes much better. We know about all the different chemical species. So there has been a lot of progress on the process level. What's the problem with communicating this progress into these large-scale global models? And so the issue is, and that's not unique to aerosol modeling, it's shared in many other fields of science as well, that aerosol modeling is a multiscale problem, right? So we have processes happening on the particle scale, down to even the molecular scale, right? And so on the global scale, what we are really interested in are these large scale signals. How do aerosol impact the global climate? On a global scale, we have to run with fairly large grid cells, even though this is going to smaller and smaller resolutions these days, but still there's a lot of variability even within, like, let's say like a 10-kilometer grid cell of a global high resolution global model. And so there is this challenge, right? How do we incorporate faithfully these processes that happen on the small scale in a tractable manner so that they can implement it in a global scale model where we want to simulate long time spans, so that the essence of the aerosol impact is captured, but we are not using up too much computational time. Yeah, and so expanding a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with what aerosols experience in the atmosphere, a little bit of a overview here, what might happen to them. So let's imagine we are coming here with some background air that contains some sort of like aged aerosol, and we go over an industrialized area. So what we are faced with is, so there are gas phase emissions, and so these gases, they react in the atmosphere and can produce vapors that are low volatility, and those vapors then can condense on the aerosol that exists in this area. Particles also bump into each other randomly due to Brownian motion, and so that changes the aerosol size distribution. We have particles being incorporated into clouds, and when the cloud evaporate, the particles that are spit out by this cloud are modified in one way or another. There are direct emissions of aerosols from different sources in an area like this, natural sources and also anthropogenic sources. And then when this cloud or this plume of aerosol goes out over the ocean here, a new type of aerosol is mixed in. So that's the sea salt aerosol in this case. And so this aging of the aerosol plume keeps going on. And so there are new types of aerosols being emitted into this aged plume, and processes happening between the gas phase and the aerosol phase continuously. And so if we take like a sample of the real aerosol somewhere outside or maybe even inside in a room and look at the aerosols in great detail. So this is a transmission electron microscope picture of different aerosol particles. You would see something like this. And so this kind of drives home, there's a lot of diversity in size, in shape, and also in the chemical composition, right? So different aerosol particles, even if you look at a narrow size range, they have different compositions. And so in terms of modeling, this is how we up against, right? So somehow we need to take this, the real aerosol state, and put them in our models so that it's still simple enough that it's tractable in a modeling framework, but that we capture the essence of the physical properties and the chemical properties of this mixture. And so the way this has been done traditionally is shown here in this overview. So the very simple aerosol models are called bulk models. And so here we just track the overall mass concentration of different constituents. And so I'm just calling the three different aerosol species here, A, B, and C, just to make it generic. And so here you are basically neglecting that aerosols come in different sizes. You're just interested in mass concentrations. So that's the simplest and most efficient way, but doesn't necessarily capture all the complexity, obviously. And so a little bit more complicated are these modal and sectional models. And so what they do is, here we're realizing size is really important for aerosol impacts, right? So aerosol cloud interactions and aerosol radiation interactions are very much driven by the size of the particles. And so the modal models represent the aerosol distribution by a certain number of overlapping modes. And so each mode can have its own composition, so indicated by these pie charts here. But within one mode, we have to make this approximation that all particles have the same composition, or we only know the average, right, for each mode. Sectional model is very similar, but here we chop up the size distribution into different size bins. Again, within each bin, we only know the average composition. And so with the particle modeling approach, we are setting the particles free, so we don't squeeze them into modes or sections, but we basically represent the whole population with a sample of computational particles. And so the advantage here is that we don't need to make the assumption that within a size range, all the particles have the same composition, or we only know the average composition. So even within a certain size, the diversity in terms of composition is captured. And then each particle undergoes the processes that we want to include in our model. And so we have much more flexibility. And so we still have to make assumptions. And one of the assumptions typically is that we assume a sphericity of our particles. So these fractal soot particles are a little bit of a problem. But otherwise, in terms of composition, there's a lot of flexibility with this modeling approach. And so what we mathematically, how this works is that here, if we go from our real particles to our model particles, we basically imagine that our cloud of particle lives in this high dimensional composition space. And so here I just drew 3 dimensions, the black carbon, sulfate, and organic carbon. In reality, of course, there are more chemical species on the order of, in our model, 20. But it's much easier to visualize if we only draw 3. And so then each particle can be thought of as a vector, right? So if we think of particle 1, 2, 3, and so on, we basically store what is contained in our particles in terms of the different components, how much black carbon, sulfate, and organic carbon. And so then each particle is placed in this composition space according to its composition. And we let the aerosol processes act on these particles now. So for example, if we have condensation of sulfate, all these 3 points here would move to the right because the sulfate content is increasing. If we have 2 particles coagulate, this one and this one, for example, we would just add their components and place the emerging particle to where the resulting coordinates determine this particle to lie on. So that's kind of how aerosol composition works if we don't constrain the aerosol into size or bins. And so then how are these different models, representations related? So we could think of these more simplified models like the bulk model or the modal model or the sectional model as low dimensional projections of a high dimensional composition space. So we can always go from the particle resolved model output to these more simplified model representations, but it's not possible to go back, right? Because due to these projections, we are losing some of the detail that is really embedded in this high dimensional composition space. So this is how these different model representations are related. Okay, so you might wonder, why does this matter? So here's a little example in terms of aerosol cloud interactions. So let's just imagine we have 2 aerosol species, an organic, which are typically, they don't like to take up water as easily as some of the inorganic species. So we have 50% organic and 50% ammonium sulfate, which is very good at taking up water. And so in one case, let's imagine these 2 species are distributed like this, which we call an external mixture. So we have half of the particles are pure sulfate and half of the particles are pure organic. So that's one way you could distribute the aerosol material over the whole population. Another way is to make each particle itself a mixture of the 2 species, like indicated here in the middle. And then, of course, in reality, it will be something in between, right? It's never completely external mixture or internal mixture. It's somewhere in between mixture that may look like this. Now, if you ask these particles, given a certain cloud supersaturation environment, how many of these aerosols would actually form cloud droplets? In the left case, the external mixture, it's half of them. Only the hygroscopic ammonium sulfate particles would be able to form cloud droplets. The organic particles, they don't like to take water up as easily, and so they won't activate. In the middle case, where we distribute the sulfate over the entire population, all of them actually can activate because each particle has this hygroscopic material on it. And so 100% of our population forms cloud droplets. And in the real world, it will be something in between, right? And so in our models, when we have to make assumptions, what is the mixing state, or do we have an external or internal mixture within a certain size range? We are either in this extreme or in this extreme, where in reality we are somewhere in between. So all these distribution-based models have this issue or this inherent assumption that all particles within one size range, may it be a mode or a bin, have the same composition. And therefore, this mixing state, how are the chemical species distributed over the population, is a structural uncertainty of the model. It's one of the unknown unknowns. Okay, and so this brings me to this analogy. An aerosol actually can be compared to an elephant, in the sense that depending on which angle you look at, you think you have a fan, right? If you touch the ear, or if you look at the body of the aerosol, it seems like a wall, or it's a tree, or if you are near the tail, you may think it's a rope. But and so in terms of the aerosol population, if we want to have a best estimate of the aerosol state, it's a similar thing, right? So depending on which angle we are coming from. So if we just look at the supermicron aerosol, we only see dust, right? So we think it's dust, even though there might be non-dust species in the submicron. If we look at a certain size range between 200 and 800 nanometer, it may seem externally mixed, and we don't know what actually is happening outside of this size range. And so the challenge really is different instruments see different aspects of the aerosol state, and similarly different aerosol models, which are these low dimensional projection of the high dimensional real aerosol state, only see certain aspects of what the real aerosol actually looks like. And so that is one of the challenges that we have in aerosol science. How do we characterize the full aerosol state really? May it be through experimental methods or through modeling. Okay, so a little bit background on particle resolved modeling. And trying to explain what are the advantages and how can we use such a model. So as I mentioned already, so with this particle resolved approach, we don't have any modes or bins. Instead, we have discrete computational particles that are a sample of the real aerosol state. And then in our modeling approach, we have two portions of the model. One is responsible for the aerosol dynamics. And so this is a stochastic approach to simulate coagulation, the emissions of particles, deposition, so the removal, particles sticking to surfaces, the formation of new particles. And so we have developed over the years a whole bunch of algorithms really to make this approach technically feasible. So how do we make these algorithms go fast enough so that we can run these simulations, even though they are expensive, in a manageable amount of time. Attached to this or coupled to this is a code that simulates the multiphase chemistry. And so here what I mean with this is we simulate gas phase chemistry, what's happening in terms of gas phase in the atmosphere, and then how does the gas phase partition with the aerosol phase. So some of the gases like sulfate, ammonium, or sulfuric acid, I should say, ammonia, and nitric acid, they, depending on what the conditions are, they go into the aerosol phase, but they can also evaporate again. And there are many organic species that do the same thing. We also have to predict are aerosols liquid or solid, right? So the phase state of the aerosol. This is all done with this code called Mosaic, which was developed by Raoul Zaveri at Pacific Northwest National Lab. And so if you imagine by having these discrete particles, it's very natural or very straightforward to represent this mixing state. How are the chemical components distributed over the population? The downside is that it's computationally expensive. And so I mentioned these papers up here where we developed algorithms to accelerate this. So if somebody doesn't have any background in aerosol modeling, I sometimes ask my students, if you had to design an aerosol model, how would you do it? It's actually, this is the most intuitive, right? So you have your real aerosol, and in the modeling world, you represent your aerosol with something like that looks like a particle. The reason why this hasn't been done for a long time, or why these other methods were put forward first, is because it is computationally expensive. And so the distribution-based methods are much more efficient in that sense. Okay, so here are the governing equations. So the n depends on space. So the x is the space coordinate. The mu is our composition vector, right? So how much of each component do we have in our aerosol particle? And then this whole thing depends on time. So we have terms here on the right-hand side that are related to transport, turbulent and advective transport. Then these two terms are the coagulation. And so there is a gain. So we can make at a certain point in our composition space, we can create particles by combining the appropriate parent particles. And then there is a loss, right? So if a certain particle in our population coagulates with any other particle, it is lost from that particular vector mu. We have emissions, we have the gas particle transfer. Water is also gas particle transfer, but water is a little bit special, so it's split out here. And then, of course, we also have the equations for our gas phase, species concentrations, and the 3D fluid flow, which goes into the transport. Okay, and so here is an example. We have done a lot of these big simulations where we coupled our aerosol part MC mosaic model to WRF, the weather and research forecast model that many of you I'm sure know. So the host model WRF supplies the wind field, temperature, humidity, and then the aerosols and the gas phase chemistry is done by part MC mosaic. Just like WRF Chem, many people know WRF Chem. So we basically took out the chem and we put in our part MC mosaic. And this model domain here is California. So down here is, or in the middle here is the Bay Area. And here I'm just showing a snapshot of the number concentration. Yeah, a map. But be assured in each of these grid boxes, which are 4 by 4 kilometer, there's a full part MC simulation living, so we know the full aerosol state, our best estimate according to what part MC mosaic is simulating. Yeah, so these simulations are very expensive. So we ran this on thousands of cores on a computer called Blue Waters here in Illinois. There are 5,000 computational particles per grid cell to capture the full aerosol state. And so billions of particles in the total simulation. So we typically run for a few days. And we try to use as many cores as are necessary to keep the runtime on the order of also a few days. So trying to make the simulation time and the runtime about the same. And so just to illustrate the information that we have, so if we take a certain grid point here, so again, this is our model domain California with the Bay Area here in the middle. So up here is, or over here is the ocean and here is the land. So if we pick a certain grid cell, how do we display our results? So we literally have this collection of computational particles. So what we often do are these two-dimensional histograms with our population where on the x-axis is particle size. And on the y-axis is some other quantity that we are interested in. So in this case, it's the organic carbon mass fraction. And then the color is the number concentration. So it's a 2D histogram or size distribution, or distribution, I should say, of the aerosol state right here. And so you can see at any given size, so let's say 10 nanometer or 100 nanometer, there's a whole continuum of organic mass fractions, right? So it's not like at a certain size, all particles have the same organic mass fractions like you would have in a sectional or in a modal model. But there is a continuum that we resolve with this particle resolved approach. And then, of course, we can drill deeper and pick literally a certain particle and know what's in it, and also what the sources are. So that's another nice thing with this approach. We can tag the particles with where it came from in terms of emissions. And so obviously this particle has coagulated several times, and it combines the contributions from different emission sources. Like here's a PT, stands for point source of natural gas and non-road diesel and so on. So we also have the source attribution for free, basically. Okay, let's move on. We don't need to talk about the algorithms that we developed for the transport so much. I rather tell you, so we have applied this sort of modeling approach for many different applications to do with aerosol aging and what is the impact of aerosols on climate, or in terms of what are the aerosol cloud interactions, and how important is mixing state really, if we drill down to this. So we looked at black carbon aging timescales. How long does it take for black carbon to become aged so it can be removed efficiently by wet deposition? Aqueous phase processes in cloud droplets, how do they modify the aerosol population? We have applied it to chamber studies. So this is partially guiding chamber studies, but also benchmarking our model. So we've done that. And then quite fundamental questions. So how many particles do we actually need to estimate mixing state? We had a paper on that where we used the model to produce synthetic data. And so yeah, it just gives you an overview of the wide range of questions that we can look at with this kind of modeling approach when we are interested in questions where mixing state might be important. Okay, so coming back to this figure right here and drilling a little bit deeper into what causes these uncertainties or these discrepancies in models when it comes to aerosol cloud and aerosol radiation interactions. And so I want to explain a little bit about parametric and structural model uncertainties, because this is what causes this spread, right? And so there are different types of uncertainties. So parametric uncertainty is when you don't know certain parameters very accurately. We have so many parameters in our aerosol models, not only aerosol models in general, but aerosol models too. And so parametric uncertainty is if you vary these parameters within reasonable ranges and quantify the impact of a certain target quantity, right? And so the group at Leeds has produced a powerful framework to do this on a large scale. And so they can tell you, okay, so certain parameters, the CCN concentration in their model output is really sensitive to the dry deposition velocity for the aerosol or something like that. Now, structural uncertainty is coming from if the underlying model does not fully describe the true system. And so that's how do we assess this? Well, we can compare two measurements if available. And of course, there are aerosol measurements available, but oftentimes they are not as fully constrained as we would like. And so sometimes when the model doesn't agree with the measurements, it's not really clear why it is, right? And so another way to approach structural uncertainties is to compare to a benchmark model if one has one. And so PodMC is, even though it makes certain assumptions, for example, in terms of particle shape, it is a benchmark model in terms of how it resolves the composition space, right? It's a benchmark model in terms of mixing state. And so this is what we have been using this model for. And so a question that we can ask is taking our model, for example, and calculating based on the simulated aerosol distribution, what are the CCN concentration, what are the concentrations of ice nuclei, what are the optical properties. Then we do the same thing with a particle resolved approach, and then the difference would be the structural uncertainty of a model due to the aerosol representation. So the fact that we are in a model, we can't represent, or we lose the identity of individual particles. What's the uncertainty introduced due to that? So that would be an approach to assess this. And so there are three pieces to this, which I want to use the remainder of my time here. The benchmark model, so Rolf Part C, I already explained to you. We also need a metric to quantify the aerosol state, to be a little bit less hand-wavy where we are between an internal and an external mixture. And then the third ingredient here is what we call the composition averaging procedure, and that's very simple. So I'll get to this in a minute. So metric for quantifying the aerosol state first. So if I would ask you, okay, so on the left, clearly we have an external mixture, right? So I explained this in this other schematic where we looked at CCN activation. That's clearly external. In the middle, internal mixture, very clear. So what about these bottom ones? So the left one is also an external mixture, but it's different than the top one, right? Because we have less species. Similar to this one down here, it's also an internal mixture, but it's not as, maybe you might want to say not as internal, because the mass fractions of the red and the blue are not the same, right? And then you could go on and create like samples of what particle composition looks like, and it can become quite tricky. What do you call this? External or internal? I don't know. Actually, it turns out in ecology, they had a similar problem with characterizing species diversity in habitats. So what they are looking at is a certain region with certain feeding areas like water holes, right? And so the top row here would represent a habitat with externally mixed water holes, right? So each water hole in this area is visited by only one animal species, compared to at the bottom here, we have internally mixed water holes where each water hole is visited by a few different animal species. And so in ecology, they struggled for quite some years to define a good metric to capture this behavior. They settled on something that is transferable to the aerosol world, like this. And so what we do is, for each, we need to know the mass fraction of our particles, right? And based on the mass fraction, we can calculate this HI value, which is, you might recognize, it's like a Shannon entropy, right? And then we take this number, we take the e to the h value to form what is called the diversity. And so as an example, this works out really nicely. If we have just one species, the diversity of this particle would be 1. If we have 2 even species, the diversity would be 2. If we have 3, even 3 species in equal amounts, you would get a diversity of 3. And then if you have uneven amounts, you are somewhere in between, right? And so this could keep going to higher diversity numbers, 4, 5, what have you. Now, if we average all the diversities, DI, over our population, we get what is called an average DI, alpha diversity for the entire population. And if this value is high, it means on average, each particle contains a lot of chemical species, right? So this is how you characterize a high diversity population versus a low diversity population. Now we do the same thing for the bulk. So what this means is we forget about the particles for a minute. We just throw all the chemical species together and calculate the diversity just for the bulk. And then we take the ratio of this. So this would be our mixing state chi then. That tells us how how close we are to an internal or an external mixture. So if we look at this example right here, this would be a d alpha of 0, right? So each particle only contains one species. but a gamma diversity, a bulk diversity of 3, because we have 3 chemical species in equal amounts in the bulk. And so as we move over here on this axis, we are moving towards an internal mixture, which is over here. So in an internal mixture, the species are most spread out over the entire population. Okay, so this is how we can quantify mixing state with just one number. And so this has been applied to measured single particle data. So people go out in the field and take samples and analyze particles on a per particle basis. What's their composition? And it really helps to compare different states to each other. How does the mixing state evolve if you go from this one station upwind to another station downwind, or how anthropogenic influences impact the mixing state? So it has been a helpful framework to put a number on what the mixing state actually looks like. And so over the years, there has been a whole body of literature now where people apply this using different analytical techniques at times. But what one has to do is one has to get down to the particle level to look at the per particle mass fractions. And from this, you can construct this mixing state index. And so what does this look like if from our model? Actually, we have it easy, right? Because it's much easier to determine it from our model output compared to the observations, because those are very intensive, labor-intensive analysis techniques. From our model, once we've run it, which of course it is a little bit expensive to run it, but once we have the output, we know exactly what is in each particle, right? And so we can construct maps of this mixing state index. And so here is again our model domain of California. And if the colors are dark and blue, this means we have external mixtures, right? In this case, we are looking at hygroscopic and non-hygroscopic species. So how is black carbon and organic carbon mixed with the inorganic species, sulfate, ammonium, and nitrate, and maybe also sodium chloride, because we have the ocean right here. So what we learn from this is in the areas where we have strong anthropogenic sources, the aerosol is more externally mixed, right? So the hygroscopic and the hydrophobic species tend to reside in different particles. Once we go more away from the sources, we get to more internal mixtures. And so this is not surprising as such. This fits with our conceptual understanding how mixing state evolves in the atmosphere, but it's also consistent with measurements that has the Carnegie Mellon Group has done these measurements in Pittsburgh, where they were driving around with a truck in different neighborhoods. And so sure enough, you see in the downtown area more external mixtures, and in the outside the cities more internal mixtures. And the other thing that you see is it's never 0 and 100%, right? It's always like rather externally mixed, so low percentages. In this case, it was 30, and to more internally mixed, so up to maybe 70%, but it's never one or the other, right? It's always somewhere on this continuum. Okay, so let's now cover the benchmark model. We know how to quantify aerosol mixing state. Now, what about this composition averaging procedure? So that's fairly simple. So what we do is we take our best estimate of our aerosol. So this might be the sample in a certain grid cell. Of course, we have many more in each grid cell, but just to illustrate this, what we do here is we keep the sizes of the particles the same, but we assign the bulk composition to each particle. So we basically smear out, we take each from each particle the components, and we average those, and then we assign this average composition to each particle. Right now they all look the same. So this is if we didn't know what the mixing state is, but we are assuming the entire population is internally mixed. And so if we now compare for example, CCN properties from our best estimate compared to the composition averaged CCN properties, this is the error that we introduced by assuming these simplified mixing states. And so we can play this game with CCN concentration, we can play it with optical properties or things like heterogeneous reaction rates, right? So this really isolates the impact of mixing state on the various climate relevant diagnostic properties. And so a result here to exemplify this for this very WRF Part-MC California simulation, if we take the populations from each grid point and calculate the error like this in terms of CCN concentration, right? So we ask, what's the actual CCN concentration? And then what's the CCN concentration after composition averaging? You get this error here on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis is the corresponding mixing state index going from 0 externally mixed to 100% perfectly internally mixed. And then you can see, so the color here is the grid cell count. And so the average here is indicated by the black line. If the population is actually fairly internally mixed, then it's okay to assume an internal mixture. That's not a big surprise. But what we found interesting is how big does the error actually get? And so it tends to be on the order of 100% or maybe even more, right? So if your population is not very internally mixed, then assuming an internal mixture can make a really big error in your CCN prediction on the order of a couple hundred of percent. And we do understand the spread. I don't have time to talk about this, but assuming internal mixture leads to an overestimation to CCN concentration, and this is the magnitude. The reason why it's an overestimation is because we basically spread the entire hygroscopic material over the entire population. And so particles that wouldn't activate, otherwise they now activate. We can do the same thing with optical properties. So here's a similar plot for now we have on the x-axis the black carbon mixing state metric between more externally mixed and internally mixed. And on the y-axis now is shown the relative error in absorption, right? And so if we assume an internal mixture, but in reality, the population is externally mixed, we commit an error on the order of 70 to 80%. Okay, so that shows a few applications how we can use this particle resolved modeling approach for verification studies. It also can be used for coarse graining. And so this is when, with the advent of machine learning, now a big opportunity here is to use this Part-MC modeling approach to create training data that then can be used to learn approximate parameterizations to use in more coarser models. And so it can be used in different ways, right? So it can be used to inform a process level understanding. So things about coagulation or aerosol gas partitioning or nucleation, or it can be used to infer diagnostic quantities such as the aerosol optical properties, the mixing state itself, or CCN concentrations. And so one of the examples I want to show in my last few minutes here is the question we were wondering, how does mixing state actually vary across different regions, right? So if we wanted to make a map of our mixing state index, what would this look like? And so what can we do to get such a map? So what we can do is the brute force way would be to implement Part-MC mosaic into a global model and then run it. And then we would be able to calculate or look what is the mixing state in each grid box, right? So we haven't done that. We have done a lot of model development with WRF Part-MC, so we haven't implemented it yet in a global model. What we did instead was to construct an emulator for the mixing state metric. And so here now the diagnostic quantity that we want to infer is the mixing state metric chi. The training data is many Part-MC box model simulations that should create mixing states that are representative across the whole globe, capturing the different environments. And then the machine learning method was very simple, just an XGBoost gradient boosted decision trees. And as features, So that's what we're trying to do here. We want to infer the mixing state based on what a global model knows. So a global model actually knows many things. It knows temperature, it knows certain gas phase species, it does know about bulk aerosol species or aerosol concentrations in certain size ranges. So we want to use this information and then predict based on an emulator that is derived from PARTMC simulations, what's the most likely mixing state in our various grid boxes around the globe. And this is what the result looks like if you do this. So this is actually averaged for different seasons, winter and summer season. And the blue indicates a more externally mixed aerosol. The red indicates a more internally mixed aerosol. So if I just wanted to highlight a couple of regions here, so this does make sense. So over the ocean here, so this is the dust plume that doesn't really mix with or internally mix with the sea salt, right? So those two species should be externally mixed. Similarly, this is the biomass burning plume. That biomass burning aerosol should be externally mixed from from the sea salt, and you can look at other regions here and interpret this, but this is what these maps are telling us. Are the hygroscopic and the non-hygroscopic species rather internally mixed, or are they rather externally mixed? Okay, and then we can compare this with the mixing state index that would actually be predicted by the aerosol model that is implemented in in this case, it's the CESM global model. This aerosol model is called MAM4 because it has 4 modes. And just looking at the pattern here, you see our PARTMC machine learned emulator thinks quite differently about the mixing state, right? Compared to what MAM4 actually predicts. So for example, in the low latitudes, MAM4 estimates like a very internally mixed aerosol, versus here we have these externally mixed patches. And then in the high latitudes, it actually predicts in quite externally mixed aerosol. So you see the blue here near the poles, which the PARTMC emulator doesn't predict. Who is right? So it would be really good to have more field measurements to compare to. Right now, this is a little bit of a bottleneck that we are working on. Okay, with this, I want to finish. I hope I was able to explain to you a little bit more about aerosol modeling, the challenges, and what role these particle resolved models can play in the model hierarchy, bridging from the particle scale to larger scales and quantifying these structural uncertainties that we have in aerosol models. And with this, I thank you for your attention. PARTMC is an open source code. So if you want to try it out, we also have a Python version, which it's basically PARTMC accessing the original Fortran code, but running in a Jupyter notebook. So you can check that out too. All right, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Riemer. So we have a couple minutes for Q&A. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. So you can go ahead and do that now, or type your question in the chat if you'd rather me just read it out loud, or me to cue you.
All right.
The first question is always the hardest one to get. I feel like people always, they have to think about it first.
I think this
No
was a long
questions?
answer. Hmm?
No questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Dr. Lee.
Yeah. Hi, Nicole. Very nice
Hi,
talk.
Duncan. Nice.
Great.
Nice.
Thank you
Yeah.
for giving us this lecture. It's really very helpful. So I really like the model approach to tackle with this very complex problem. I'm doing a lot of observation studies, and it is in the real world is even more challenging to deal with all kind of aerosol with many different mixture types, etc. So I found there is a big gap between model and observation. So basically, in a model, you can design all kind of model from simple to complex as you described. But in nature, this model is so variety, so many. It's just hard to imagine how can we put it into the model in a realistic sense. I'll give you an example. In early days, I had a PhD student that did aerosol optical depth retrieval. And we know that aerosol size distribution is important, but there's no way to know exactly what the type of a model should we use. In the model, you can resolve into many bins, but in the observation, this kind of measurement are very, very so few and small. So as a result, remote system people use aerosol size distribution function like gamma distribution, log normal distribution, etc., so that you can simplify the distribution by just a couple of parameters. But even between these two, the retrieved optical depth for the same satellite measured radiance can differ by a factor of 50% overall. So that means, there is no simple solution to retrieval without knowing the particle size distribution. So how do you deal with this kind of complication in the model by echoing the real world problem?
Yeah, this is a really, really good point. I don't think I have a good answer with this. Obviously, when we simulate aerosols, we get the size distribution, right? It may not be correct, but that's something very inherent that we get from our model output. And so not only our model, but modal models or sectional models, they do simulate a size distribution, and that size distribution evolves with time, and it's different in different locations, it's different in the vertical. So I think in terms of satellite retrievals, which is not, I wish I would know more how satellite retrievals really work deep inside. Rather than taking just a assumed distribution, could you use model output from a global model, for example, that sort of helps you to, because that's a pretty big sensitivity, right? Depending on what you assume. And it's probably different in different seasons, and it's very hard to make this choice, right? And so could you use model output to guide you, like what should the size distribution look like? And then I think another complication is not to making your life more complicated, but the mixing state is also a really big point. I think right now you are assuming a certain composition and how it's mixed, right? Like how the black carbon is mixed with the sulfate. But I think a model like PartMC could help you with making decisions, even like a map like this, right? Should you assume the black carbon to be separate from the sulfate or together with the sulfate? I think that could constrain these choices so that you don't just blindly make a certain choice. That would be my idea here.
Yeah, this is a good suggestion. As a matter of fact, we do use some model as a guideline. So the question is, if we can trust model, different type of aerosol have a different certain distinction in terms of size distribution, the shape of function. If that kind of the type of function is fixed for or better known for certain type of aerosol, then model can help us to do the mixing of different type of aerosol. Then we can do that. Yeah. Then the next question is how much model of this distribution is actually based on observation. So we are kind of mutually dependent on each other, right?
Right, yeah. And I think what one probably also needs to bring in are the in situ observations, right? Like that actually measure size distributions. That is that's a much stronger constraint than something like aerosol optical depth, right? Because you can get well, let's say if the aerosol optical depth is actually well represented, it's still, you could have compensating errors, right? Because it's integrated over the entire column. So there's that. If it doesn't fit well, then, well, who knows where the error is, right? It's really hard to, there's a lot of degrees of freedom why something doesn't fit or does fit. So having really the ground truth by somebody measuring size distribution somewhere, and of course then it's only one point, but yeah, that's what we have to work with, I think. Yeah,
indeed. Thank
yeah,
you. Thank you. Mhm.
yeah, it is very challenging.
Right. Same thing for the mixing
Yeah.
as well,
Mhm.
which is very crucial for CCN kind of thing.
Okay, there's a question by Bhavan. Hi, Bhavan. The initial slides, the model regarding, do you have any thoughts on how much this uncertainty might shrink by the end of the study? Any rough percentage? Okay, so I think, you know, we with this sort of like modeling approach, we have been laying the foundation to even address these how do we get to these structural uncertainties, right? Because before we started this, all that was being done was looking at parametric uncertainty, right? So we change the values of certain parameters in certain bounds and see what's the outcome, which is, it sounds simple, but given how many parameters we have, right, it's actually also really challenging to do this comprehensively. And so I mentioned the group in Leeds who has been really on the forefront of this. Now, what we are doing here and really now reducing the uncertainties in actual global models, there are many steps in between, right? So I would be hard pressed to say by what kind of percentage the bottom line, what this will come out to. I would hope we would be able to, by doing some more sophisticated aerosol modeling within global models, and it doesn't mean it has to be particle resolved, right? But something more not as handcrafted as the modes that we currently have, right? That it will decrease by some amount, but by what kind of amount, I wouldn't know until we have done it. Another way, I should have put this study, I should have mentioned this study. So there's a group in China, they used this mixing state index. So they didn't actually change their aerosol model. It's still a modal model with 4 modes, but they used this mixing state index or a variant of this to sort of like, before they calculate optical properties, to redistribute or to dial how much black carbon is actually mixed versus not mixed, and what the proportion is of particles that do not have any black carbon, right? So this black carbon mixing state, they use this information from the emulator to fine-tune, that's the word I was looking for, fine-tune their mode assignment. And so this has shown to help to make the predictions, bring the predictions closer to the observations. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of scope here where this is going, and we laid the foundation, and so there's more work to do.
Thank you. Do we have any other super quick questions? Because Professor Riemer does have a meeting. So I just ask you now, hold your peace. Okay, well then, thank you so much, Professor Riemer, for giving us this great talk. That was super interesting. And thank you to everybody else for joining us. Again, this was our last seminar of the semester. So I just want to give John is not here, but I want to give a heartfelt thank you to everybody for coming to and supporting the series for just another semester. So we'll continue in the spring as always. And in the meantime, we have tons of YouTube videos of seminars, including this one, if you want to revisit it. So anyway, have a great afternoon, everybody. I will see you all in the spring. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a good break. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.